It was late evening when most of the offices were already empty. The lights in the tall glass building were dimmed, and only a few floors still glowed softly. Inside, a man pushed a cleaning cart through the quiet hallways. His uniform was plain, his hands a little rough, and his eyes carried the weight of many sleepless nights. To everyone who worked there, he was just a janitor. He kept his head down, moving silently from one office to another, sweeping floors, wiping desks, and emptying trash bins. Nobody paid him much attention. People often walked past him without even a glance, as if he were invisible. And maybe that was exactly what he wanted. What no one knew was that this man carried a secret. Behind the tired smile and the quiet routine was someone very different. But he never spoke of his past, never hinted at who he once was. He had chosen this life deliberately, a life where he could blend into the background. Every night, after finishing his shift, he would walk home with slow, steady steps. The building where he lived was small and simple, but inside was his entire world. His young daughter. She was the reason he woke up every morning, the reason he endured long hours of cleaning and mopping, the reason he never complained. His daughter always greeted him at the door, her little arms wrapping tightly around him, her eyes lighting up like he was the most important person in the universe. And to her, he truly was. They would sit together for dinner, laugh about her day at school, and sometimes read a bedtime story before she fell asleep. For her, he was not just a father. He was her comfort, her guide, her whole family. But for the world outside, he was just a man in a janitor's uniform. When co-workers at the company saw him, they would sometimes whisper. Some thought it was strange how such a quiet man kept to himself. Others wondered why he seemed more observant than most. A few even thought he was simply too serious for a job like his. But he never explained himself. He never gave anyone answers. He just kept working, hour after hour, floor after floor. There was a calmness about him, a steady patience. Yet, inside, he carried memories that could never be erased. Once upon a time, his life had been very different. He had worn another uniform, one that demanded courage and skill. Back then, he was respected, even admired. But tragedy had changed everything. The day he lost his wife, his world shifted forever. He had walked away from the life he once knew, leaving behind titles, medals, and recognition. All he wanted now was peace and safety for his daughter. Taking the janitor's job was his way of disappearing. He knew nobody would ask questions. Nobody would look closely at a man pushing a mop down a hallway. And that was perfect. It allowed him to stay close to his daughter, to be present for her every day, to live quietly without drawing attention. He told himself again and again, as long as she is safe, this is enough. But sometimes, late at night, when the building was empty and silent, he felt the weight of who he truly was. As he cleaned the glass doors or polished the floors, memories from his past would creep in. The sharp sound of footsteps, the quick decisions he once had to make, the dangerous situations he had faced. Those things never really left him. He buried them deep, but they were still there, locked inside. His daughter never knew about that part of him. To her, he was just Dad, the man who tucked her in, the man who always kept his promises. And he liked it that way. He wanted her to grow up with warmth, not with fear. Still, there were moments when she would look at him curiously, almost as if she sensed something unspoken. Like the way he always checked the locks twice before bed, or the way he seemed to notice details that others ignored, or how calm he stayed in moments that would make most people nervous. She never asked about it, and he never offered an explanation. Some truths, he believed, were better left hidden. At work, his life followed the same pattern. He moved from one floor to another, cleaning quietly, listening without meaning to, observing things most people missed. People thought he was simply slow and careful with his work, but really it was something else. His training never allowed him to fully switch off. Even in silence, his mind remained sharp. There was one young employee in the office who once asked him, "Why do you always seem so focused?" "It's just cleaning." He had smiled faintly and said, "Every job deserves to be done properly." The young employee had laughed and walked away, never realizing those words carried a much deeper meaning. This was his life now, hidden in plain sight, blending into the background. He never wanted to stand out. He never wanted anyone to look at him twice. And for years it worked. Nobody guessed who he really was. Nobody questioned why a man like him had chosen a job so small compared to what he was capable of. But what he didn't know was that life was about to test him again. He had spent so long trying to bury his past, to live quietly, to remain invisible. Yet, no secret stays buried forever. Soon, something would happen that would force him out of the shadows. Something that would make everyone in that building see him in a way they never had before. And when that moment came, his true self, the man he had tried so hard to hide, would finally be revealed. For now, though, he walked through the long, quiet halls, mop in hand, just another worker finishing his night shift. But fate was already preparing the test that would change everything. The days went on quietly, just the way he liked them. At work, he kept his head down, finishing his duties without a fuss. At home, he became a different man, lighter, warmer, almost as if he saved his entire heart for the little girl waiting for him at the end of each day. Their apartment was small, but it was filled with love. The kitchen table carried signs of their simple dinners, bowls of rice, vegetables, sometimes noodles, sometimes soup. The walls were decorated with her drawings, stick figures with big smiles, sometimes a picture of her and her father holding hands. Those little drawings were his treasures. He taped them up proudly, as if they were fine art. Every evening, after dinner, she would chatter endlessly about her day. She would tell him who she sat with at school, how her teacher praised her handwriting, and what games she played with her friends. He listened carefully to every word, nodding, smiling, and asking gentle questions. He wanted her to know that her stories mattered, that her little world was as important to him as the biggest matters in the world once were. But there were things he never told her. She was too young to understand. She didn't know that her father once lived a very different life. Long before the mop and bucket, long before he carried a lunchbox with rice and bread for his shift, he wore another kind of uniform. It was the kind that came with responsibility, risk, and unshakable discipline. He had been trained to make decisions in the most dangerous moments, to protect others, to face situations that most people would never want to see. Back then, people looked at him with respect. They saluted him, relied on him, even admired him. He was part of something bigger than himself. But all of that ended the day tragedy struck. When his wife passed away, his world collapsed. He still remembered her smile, her soft voice, the way she had believed in him no matter how difficult life became. She had been his strength, his balance, the light in his storm. Losing her was like losing half of himself. For weeks, he could hardly breathe. But then he looked at his daughter, so small, so fragile, and realized he didn't have the luxury to fall apart. She needed him more than ever. She needed him to be mother and father, protector and guide, all in one. That was the moment he made a choice. He turned his back on the life he had lived before. The medals and certificates went into a box. The uniform went into storage. He told himself he would never again step into that world of danger. Instead, he would live quietly, taking a job where nobody would expect too much from him, a job that would allow him to come home safely every night. Becoming a janitor was not about money or ambition. It was about survival, his daughter's survival. He wanted a life where she would never wake up worried about whether her father would come home. And so he created a new identity for himself, one that was plain, humble, and ordinary. He worked late hours cleaning floors, fixing lights, taking out trash. Nobody asked him questions, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But the truth was, no matter how hard he tried, he could never fully escape the man he once was. His habits gave him away in little ways. He always sat facing the door in restaurants. He noticed exits, shadows, and movements without even trying. When he walked his daughter to school, his eyes scanned the street in quiet vigilance. Other parents might have thought he was overly cautious. But for him, it was natural. Once you had lived the life he had, you could never really switch it off. His daughter sometimes caught these small habits. "Dad, why do you always lock the door twice?" she once asked. He smiled and said, "Because I want to make sure you're safe." It was the truth, but not the whole truth. She didn't need to know that his instincts were built from years of facing danger. All she needed to know was that her father would always protect her. Still, every now and then, he wondered if he had made the right choice. Was he being selfish by hiding? Should he have continued his old life, risking everything but serving others? Or was it better to put all his energy into raising one little girl? Those thoughts sometimes haunted him in the quiet of the night. But when he looked at her peaceful face as she slept, her small hand curled against her pillow, he knew his answer. She was his mission now. She was the reason he had walked away from everything else. At work, he stayed in the background, blending in with the noise of the office. Employees rushed past him, busy with meetings, calls, and deadlines. None of them cared about the janitor mopping the floor. And he didn't mind. Being invisible was his shield. But despite his silence, he noticed things others didn't. He noticed which employees stayed late, which ones seemed nervous, who argued with whom. He noticed security cameras that weren't working, doors that didn't lock properly, guards who weren't paying attention. His sharp mind couldn't stop observing, analyzing, storing details. He kept these thoughts to himself. No one needed to know what he saw. He wasn't there to interfere, only to do his job and go home. But deep down, he knew he could never completely erase the man he used to be. Every now and then, when he was alone in the empty hallways, he would pause for a moment and stare at his reflection in the glass doors. The man staring back looked tired, older, worn by life. But in his eyes, there was still a spark, something strong, something that had not been broken by time or loss. He would sigh, pick up his mop again, and whisper to himself, "This is who I am now." What he didn't realize was that life had other plans. The very skills he had buried would soon become the only thing standing between safety and disaster. He thought he had left his old life behind forever, but fate was quietly preparing to pull him back into it. And when that day came, the world would finally see the man hiding behind the janitor's uniform. The week had started like any other. The building was alive with the usual noise of ringing phones, echoing footsteps, and voices bouncing between meetings. People rushed through the glass doors with coffee in hand, some greeting the janitor with a polite nod, others passing without a glance. To them, he was part of the background, like the walls or the elevator music. That evening, the air felt heavier than usual. Clouds gathered outside the tall windows, painting the city in shades of gray. The janitor was pushing his cart through the lobby when he noticed the security guard at the desk yawning, barely paying attention to the monitors. He shook his head slightly, but said nothing. Years of training told him that security gaps were dangerous, but this wasn't his job anymore. He reminded himself, as always, to stay quiet and invisible. He took the elevator to the upper floors, moving from office to office. It was the same routine: wipe the desks, empty the trash, polish the glass. Yet something inside him was unsettled, as though the silence of the building carried a warning. And then it happened. The glass doors of the lobby slammed open. A group of armed men rushed in, their voices sharp and commanding. Shouts filled the air. "Everyone down," one of them barked. The security guard froze, his hands trembling. Employees screamed as the intruders stormed the building, forcing people into the center of the lobby. The janitor, who had been on the 12th floor, froze when he heard the echo of chaos below. His grip tightened on the handle of his mop. His heartbeat quickened, but his face remained calm. He moved quietly to the stairwell door and cracked it open, listening carefully. The sounds of panic were clear: shouts, hurried footsteps, a cry that carried up through the building. He didn't need to see them to know what was happening. Years of experience told him immediately. This was a hostage situation. The intruders weren't ordinary thieves. They moved with discipline, their orders sharp and precise. He could tell they were prepared, maybe even trained. And they weren't after money from cash drawers or laptops. Their target was bigger. Downstairs, the employees were being herded into a corner of the lobby. Phones were taken away. Hands were raised in fear. The leader of the intruders barked at the security guard, demanding access to the executive offices. In the middle of the panic, the CEO himself appeared, flanked by 2 assistants. The moment the intruders saw him, their focus sharpened. One grabbed him by the arm, forcing him forward. "You're coming with us," the man growled. The assistants screamed but were quickly silenced. The janitor's eyes narrowed. This was no random attack. The CEO was the target. He stepped back into the stairwell, breathing slowly to steady himself. This was the kind of moment he had spent years training for, the kind of danger he thought he had left behind. But here it was, right in front of him. His first thought was his daughter. She was safe at home, probably finishing her homework or drawing another picture to surprise him with. He had promised her a quiet life. He had promised himself that his days of danger were over. But what about the people downstairs? What about the terrified employees huddled in the lobby? He closed his eyes for a moment, and in that silence, his decision became clear. He could not stand by. Moving carefully, he returned to the hallway. He set down his mop and cleaning cart, tucking them against the wall. His posture changed. The quiet, tired janitor was gone. His shoulders straightened, his eyes sharpened, his movements deliberate. He scanned the hallway, noting the exits, the angles, the possible hiding places. His mind clicked into a mode he hadn't used in years. The man he once was, the man he had tried to bury, was back. Downstairs, the intruders were forcing the CEO toward a conference room. The employees watched in terror, whispering to one another, wondering what would happen next. None of them noticed the janitor slip silently down the stairwell, moving like a shadow. He paused on the 5th floor, crouching near the window that overlooked the lobby. From there, he could see everything. He studied the intruders, the way they held their weapons, the way they positioned themselves, the way they spoke to one another. Every detail mattered. He didn't act immediately. He couldn't. If he made a mistake, lives could be lost. He needed to wait, to watch, to find the moment when he could make a difference without putting others in greater danger. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He remembered every lesson, every drill, every real-life moment from his past. Fear was natural, but control was necessary. For now, he stayed in the shadows, invisible to everyone. The employees thought the janitor was probably hiding somewhere, too scared to come out. The intruders never gave him a second thought. And that was exactly what he needed. Because soon, very soon, the invisible janitor was going to do something no one expected. The conference room was locked from the inside now. The intruders had forced the CEO inside along with a handful of employees. The air in the building was heavy with fear. People whispered prayers, some sat frozen, others trembled openly. But in the shadows of the stairwell, the janitor crouched low, his breathing steady. He had been watching for long enough to understand the pattern. The intruders were moving in rotations, 2 stationed at the lobby doors, 1 near the elevators, and 2 keeping guard outside the conference room. Their leader was inside with the CEO. Most people would have felt hopeless seeing the odds, but to him, it was information. Information meant possibilities. He leaned against the cold wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment. His daughter's face filled his mind, her laughter, her drawings taped to the kitchen wall, the way she hugged him every night. That image gave him strength. He couldn't let fear control him. Not now. He quietly slipped back into the hallway. With careful steps, he moved toward the maintenance closet. Inside, he found the supplies he knew would be there: ropes, tape, a toolbox, even an old radio. To anyone else, these were ordinary items. To him, they were tools. He picked only what he needed, tucking them into his uniform pockets. Then he returned to the shadows. From his position, he noticed one of the intruders pacing near the elevators, restless. The man's focus drifted for a moment as he adjusted the strap of his bag. That was all the opening the janitor needed. He moved silently, his steps soft against the carpeted floor. In seconds, he was behind the intruder. With quick precision, he pulled him backward into the stairwell, muffling the man's attempt to shout. Within moments, the intruder was bound and unconscious, hidden behind the door where no one would find him. The janitor's eyes sharpened. His hands no longer looked like those of a cleaner. They looked like the hands of a man trained for survival. Back in the lobby, no one had noticed the missing guard yet. The janitor stayed low, calculating his next move. He couldn't storm in recklessly. If he made the wrong decision, the hostages could suffer. He needed patience. He needed timing. The employees trapped inside the conference room sat in terrified silence. The CEO tried to remain composed, but even his eyes betrayed fear. "Please," one of the younger employees whispered to him, "what will happen to us?" The CEO had no answer. But outside, in the dark edges of the hallway, the janitor had answers. He knew he couldn't free everyone at once, but he could weaken the intruders step by step. He waited again, studying their movements, and soon another mistake appeared. One of the men guarding the conference room grew impatient, pulling out his phone and pacing a few feet away from the door. His weapon dangled carelessly at his side. That was enough. The janitor struck fast, pulling the man back into the shadows, disarming him, and leaving him restrained with a rope from the supply closet. Another intruder gone, another threat silenced. Still, no alarm was raised. For the first time since the chaos began, the balance was shifting. The hostages inside didn't know it yet, but someone was fighting for them. Down in the lobby, the leader of the intruders barked orders. He was growing impatient. "We came for the CEO, not to waste time. Move faster." His men nodded, still unaware that their numbers were thinning. The janitor's heart beat calmly now. The fear that had pressed against him earlier had turned into focus. He remembered the years of training, the endless drills where he learned to stay sharp under pressure. His body remembered every move. His mind remembered every detail. But it wasn't just training driving him. It was something deeper, his promise to protect, his need to keep people safe, the very part of himself he had tried to bury. He thought of his daughter again. If she were here, if she were one of the hostages, what would he do? The answer was simple. He would do everything. And in that moment, he knew that he couldn't stop until every single hostage was safe. From his vantage point, he caught the frightened eyes of one employee through the glass of the conference room door. Their gaze locked for a brief second. The employee's eyes widened. Was the janitor helping him? The man in the uniform who everyone ignored, the one who blended into the background, was suddenly their silent protector. The janitor raised one finger to his lips, signaling for silence. The employee nodded quickly, tears in their eyes. The ordinary man was no longer ordinary. He moved again, his figure blending into the dim light of the hallway. Step by step, he worked to bring the intruders down, each action calculated, each move precise. And though the employees didn't yet know how, they began to feel a shift. The fear that had frozen them was slowly being replaced by something else. Hope. No one knew his past. No one knew what he was capable of. But soon everyone would see. Because the janitor they had overlooked for so long was about to change everything. The building had grown eerily quiet, broken only by the muffled cries of employees and the sharp commands of the intruders. Tension pressed down like a heavy blanket, making it hard for anyone to breathe. Inside the conference room, the hostages huddled together, every second stretching painfully slow. Some prayed silently. Others stared at the floor, afraid to meet the cold eyes of the men guarding them. The CEO sat at the center, his face pale but his posture firm, trying to show strength even as fear crept through his chest. And yet, beyond the door, in the dim hallway, something was happening. The janitor, the man everyone thought was invisible, had already disarmed and restrained two intruders without being noticed. His calmness was unsettling, almost unnatural for someone who was supposed to be just a cleaner. But he wasn't just a cleaner. Not anymore. He crouched low by the conference room, studying the two remaining guards. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steady, his eyes sharp. This was the moment he had avoided for years, the moment when he would have to step out of the shadows. The guards shifted uneasily. One leaned against the wall. The other stood near the door with his weapon hanging lazily at his side. They weren't expecting resistance. Why would they? To them, the building was full of frightened workers, people too powerless to act. But they had overlooked the one man who was never powerless, no matter how simple his uniform seemed. The janitor moved fast. In a single motion, he grabbed the first guard, twisting his arm and pulling him into the hallway. The man tried to shout, but his cry was cut short as he was forced to the ground. Before the second guard could react, the janitor struck, knocking the weapon from his hands and overpowering him with sharp, precise movements. It happened so quickly. The hostages inside the room didn't even realize the guards outside were gone. He pulled the fallen men out of sight, binding them tightly with rope from the supply closet. Then, standing quietly in the hallway, he listened. Inside the conference room, the leader's voice boomed. "You don't move until we get what we want," he growled at the CEO. "You cooperate and maybe you live." The janitor's jaw tightened. This wasn't about money or business anymore. This was about lives. He pushed the conference room door open slowly. The hostages gasped, expecting another intruder. But what they saw instead made their eyes widen in disbelief. The janitor stepped inside. At first, no one moved. He looked almost the same, uniform dusty, mop water still on his sleeves, but his posture was different. He wasn't slouched or tired. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his eyes sharp and unflinching. It was as though an entirely new man had walked in wearing the same uniform. The leader turned, surprised to see him. "What do you think you're doing here, old man?" he sneered. "Go back to your bucket." But the janitor didn't move. His voice was calm, firm, steady. "Let them go." The hostages stared, hardly believing what they were hearing. Was the janitor confronting the leader? The intruder laughed. "And what are you going to do if I don't?" He raised his weapon threateningly. The janitor didn't flinch. In a flash, he moved forward, faster than the leader expected. The weapon clattered to the floor as the janitor knocked it away, his grip unyielding, his movements precise. Within moments, the leader was disarmed, pinned against the table. The room fell into stunned silence. The employees could hardly breathe. The man they had passed every day in the halls, the man they had ignored as he cleaned their offices, had just taken down the most dangerous threat in the room. The CEO stared at him, disbelief in his eyes. Who are you?" he whispered. The janitor looked at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought about staying silent, about keeping his secret locked away. But then he realized it was too late. The truth was standing in front of everyone now. "I used to be someone else," he said quietly. "Someone trained for moments like this. But I left that life behind until tonight." Gasps rippled through the hostages. They looked at him not with dismissal, but with awe. The janitor was no janitor at all. He was something more, someone they would never have guessed. The CEO's voice shook. "You saved us. You saved my life." The janitor didn't answer right away. He tightened the knots around the leader's wrists, making sure he couldn't escape. Then he finally spoke, his tone low but strong. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people suffer." The employees exchanged glances, their fear slowly dissolving into admiration. The man they had overlooked, the man they had passed in the hallway without a word, had been the one to protect them when no one else could. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance now. The authorities had been alerted, no doubt by someone who managed to escape earlier or by the security system finally catching up. Help was on the way. But for the hostages, the real savior was already standing before them. One of the younger employees whispered, almost in disbelief, "All this time, and we never knew who he really was." The janitor turned his eyes toward the group, and for the first time that night, a faint smile tugged at his lips. Sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who will stand up when it matters most. The CEO lowered his head respectfully. For a man of power who was used to being in control, it was humbling to realize his life had been saved by someone he had likely walked past dozens of times without a second thought. The janitor glanced toward the windows, hearing the sirens grow louder. Soon, the building would be filled with police and reporters. His secret was no longer a secret. His quiet life of anonymity was gone. But in that moment, he didn't regret it. Lives had been saved. That was what mattered. And yet, deep in his heart, one thought lingered. What would his daughter think when she found out? Would she see him differently now? Or would she understand why he had chosen this path? For now, there was no time to dwell. He had done what needed to be done. The man in the janitor's uniform had revealed his true self at last. The flashing red and blue lights filled the street outside. Police cars surrounded the tall glass building. Officers rushing in, weapons drawn, voices cutting through the night. The danger was over, but the weight of what had just happened still hung heavy in the air. Inside, the employees slowly began to stand, still shaky from fear, but no longer trapped by it. The CEO exhaled deeply, relief softening his stiff posture. For the first time in hours, there was safety. But all eyes kept turning to one man. The janitor stood quietly near the wall, hands tucked behind his back, as if he were trying to fade into the background again. He had no desire for the spotlight, no interest in being hailed as a hero. Yet, no matter how much he tried, he couldn't disappear anymore. Everyone in the room knew the truth now. The police entered and quickly secured the remaining intruders. They asked questions, took statements, and guided the hostages out of the building. Reporters had already begun gathering outside, their cameras ready, their voices eager to tell the story of the mystery man who had stopped the crisis. The janitor didn't say much. He simply nodded to the authorities, gave the minimal details they needed, and refused any interviews. When one officer pressed him, "Sir, people deserve to know who you are. You saved them all." The janitor shook his head. "I'm no one," he said softly. "Just a father who did what he had to do." And with that, he slipped out of the building, avoiding the crowd of cameras waiting at the front. He took the back exit, walking into the cool night air. The city lights shimmered above him, but he barely noticed. His only thought was of home. The walk felt longer than usual. Each step carried not only exhaustion, but also the quiet realization that his life had changed. He had spent years building a cover of simplicity, keeping his past locked away. But secrets had a way of surfacing, and his had just been revealed in the most public way possible. When he finally reached his apartment, the familiar sight of the worn steps and little balcony calmed him. He opened the door gently, careful not to wake his daughter if she had already fallen asleep. But she was awake. She was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring a picture, her small legs swinging under the chair. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit up. "Daddy," she said, running toward him. He bent down, catching her in his arms, holding her tight. The smell of crayons lingered in her hair, and the warmth of her embrace eased the heaviness in his chest. "You're home," she whispered. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm home." She leaned back, studying his face with her curious eyes. "You look tired," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "A little, but I'm okay." She tilted her head, almost as if she could sense something different. Children had a way of seeing what adults often missed. "Did something happen?" she asked. For a moment he froze. How could he explain? How could he tell her that tonight he had fought men with weapons? That he had revealed a part of himself he had tried so hard to hide? He didn't want to frighten her. He didn't want her to see him as anything but her father, the man who cooked her meals, walked her to school, and read her bedtime stories. So he knelt down, brushing her hair gently behind her ear. "Something did happen," he said carefully. "But the important thing is people are safe now." Her small brow furrowed, but then she smiled. "That's good." He hugged her again, holding on longer this time. She didn't need all the details. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. For now, it was enough that she was safe, that he was here with her, and that their little world was intact. Later that night, after she had fallen asleep, he stood by her door, watching her breathe peacefully. In the quiet, his thoughts returned to the events of the evening. The frightened faces of the hostages, the sharp commands of the intruders, the disbelief in the CEO's eyes when the truth was revealed. It all replayed in his mind. He knew things would not go back to the way they were. Tomorrow, the story would be everywhere. The news would run headlines about the janitor hero, about the man who saved a CEO from a hostage crisis. His picture would be splashed across screens, his secret life exposed to the world. But he also knew one thing. No matter what others thought of him now, his daughter would still see him the same way. To her, he was just Dad. And that was all he wanted to be. In the days that followed, offers poured in. The company tried to reward him. Reporters begged for interviews. Even government officials reached out quietly. But he turned them all down. He wasn't interested in glory or money or recognition. He only wanted the simple life he had built with his daughter. When he returned to work, something had changed. People no longer walked past him without a glance. They greeted him warmly, some with gratitude in their voices, others with awe in their eyes. The CEO himself shook his hand firmly, saying, "I owe you everything." The janitor only nodded. "Just take care of your people," he said simply. Though life seemed the same, the mop, the cart, the endless halls, everyone now knew he was more than the uniform he wore. The man who once blended into the background was no longer invisible. He had reminded them all that true strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stays quiet until the moment it's needed most. And every night, when he walked home to his daughter, he carried the same thought in his heart. He didn't need the world's recognition. He didn't need to be called a hero. His greatest reward was hearing her laugh, seeing her smile, and knowing she was safe. Because at the end of everything, that was the only title he cared about. Not soldier, not protector, not even hero. Just father.